It's April 14th, 1912. At 11:40 p.m., the Titanic, going at a snail's pace thanks to heating iceberg warnings, spots an iceberg, illuminated by the moon and waves breaking against its base. With plenty of time to change course, First Officer William Murdoch leisurely orders helmsman Robert Hitchens to turn the ship to port. Hitchens does just that. The iceberg glides by and continues its unremarkable journey south, while the Titanic continues its unremarkable journey west. This was almost history. Of course, it wasn't actually history. The Royal Mail ship Titanic was christened in 1909 by the White Star Line. The Olympic-class liner was one of the 3 Olympic-class ships that was meant to cross the Atlantic. On April 10, 1912, it began its maiden voyage from Southampton and was set to arrive in New York 7 days later. Of course, the ship never would arrive. On April 14th at 11:40 p.m., Titanic struck an iceberg in the Atlantic via a glancing blow. Less than 3 hours later, the ship was gone. Of the 2,224 passengers and crew, an estimated 1,514 died. It was one of the worst ship-related disasters in the world, and remains that way even today. However, here's the thing. Despite the hubris, the Titanic was really safe. It was built for luxury and stability. It was built to be unsinkable. And yet it sank anyway, despite having the latest in technological and safety standards. For that to happen, one thing didn't go wrong. Everything went wrong. But that also means that the reverse is true. If one thing had gone just a little differently, the fate of the Titanic and everyone on board could have been very different. So, let's get into it. Here are 5 ways that the Titanic disaster could have been avoided. So, this is going to be a theme throughout this video, and one that we will keep coming back to. The construction of the Titanic was just not up to snuff. And no, I'm not comparing it to today's modern cruise ships, which are more like floating malls at sea than ocean-faring vessels. Even at the time, shipbuilders should have known better. And nowhere is that more apparent than with the ship's watertight bulkheads. Here's the deal. The ship was considered and marketed as unsinkable, in part, because of its watertight compartments. The Titanic had 16 watertight compartments that traversed its hull. These compartments were connected by doors, which could be closed at the touch of a button from the ship's bridge. The theory was that the Titanic could still sail with 4 compartments fully flooded. Here's the thing. There was nothing watertight about these compartments. Most of us get that water has mass, right? If a supposedly watertight compartment filled up, it would pull the ship further down into the water. And therein lies the fatal problem for the Titanic. Its watertight compartments had no ceiling. The end result was that the ship flooded, pulling it further down into the water. Water then spilled over the top of one of those watertight sections, and into the next one, moving faster and faster until the ship sank. So when 6 of the compartments flooded, the ship's pumps couldn't keep up, and it sank in 2 hours 40 minutes. Could this chain reaction have been avoided? Maybe. If the watertight compartments had been topped, it is distinctly possible that the water would have been contained. At a minimum, it would have given the ship more time. Incidentally, you can file this under lessons learned. The Olympic and the Britannic, Titanic's sister ships, were renovated to extend the watertight bulkheads up to the ship's B deck. Next, I want to talk about the idea that the Titanic would have been safer if it had hit the iceberg head-on. Yeah, I know, that sounds really weird. Many have noted the sideswipe of the iceberg was so deadly precisely because it was so minor. The iceberg collision sliced open the Titanic's metal skin in 6 compartments, which made staying afloat impossible. If there had been a head-on collision, the bow, that's the forward part of the ship, would have been crushed. There would have almost certainly been injuries and fatalities, and there would have been water that flooded into the Titanic. Here's the thing though. The theory is that the flooding would have been isolated to the bow, rather than spread across 6 compartments. This makes it possible that the Titanic's safety features could have saved the ship. Now, that being said, this is sort of a hindsight is 2021. After all, when most of us are driving and see an obstruction in the road, the natural reflex is to go around it rather than smash into the object head-on. Third, the iceberg warnings. So I don't know if you know this or not, but the Atlantic Ocean is cold. Maybe not as cold as it used to be, but that's a story for another video. The Titanic had received no less than 7 iceberg warnings from ships in the area. Warnings about bergs, growlers, and large quantities of field ice. It got so bad that Jack Phillips, who was operating the wireless radio on board the Titanic, actually cut off one of the warnings, replying to the operators with a terse, shut up, I'm working Cape Race," as he tried to send out passenger messages. So, what was the alternative here? Well, Captain Smith could have heeded warnings and slowed. Contrary to some media speculation at the time, and contrary to what was implied in the 1997 Titanic movie, Captain Smith was never trying to break the speed record, then known as the Blue Ribbon for the fastest westward crossing of the Atlantic. At the time, that record was held by the Mauretania, which had a guaranteed speed of 24 knots, and it was capable of hitting 28 knots. The Titanic was built for luxury and stability, not speed. It had a cruising speed of 21 knots and a maximum speed of 23. However, Captain Smith was trying to stick to a tight, predetermined schedule, and slowing down was certainly frowned upon. Could Captain Smith have slowed? Yeah. He was traveling at 22 knots when the Titanic hit. Should he have? In hindsight, of course. If the ship was going slower, if they had heeded the Iceberg Warnings, then the crew may have had more time to spot the iceberg, turn the ship, and avoided the collision. Of course, they would have had to have seen the iceberg earlier, and that leads us directly to item number 4, the weather. The weather on the night of the disaster was uniquely ill-suited to sink the Titanic. That's not an exaggeration. It was almost as bad as could get. There was no moon and no wind. Both were key for lookouts Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, who were in the crow's nest and keeping an eye out for icebergs. Moon illuminates the ocean and helped lookouts actually see icebergs. So did the wind. The sea was extraordinarily calm the night of the collision, with observers from the day saying that there were no waves, and others describing the sea as, quote, like glass, so smooth that the stars were clearly reflected. This meant that there were no waves that broke on the base of the icebergs, making them much harder to see. It's also worth noting that one final weather contribution came to pass that fateful day. A large, high-pressure cell that made it colder than usual. This pushed icebergs further south than usual, and this ultimately created the conditions that sank the Titanic. We're concluding this video by returning to the construction of the ship and discussing a little-known factor in the ship's sinking, the metallic makeup of its rivets. Let's start at the beginning. Rivets are small pieces of metal that hold sections of the hull together. They were critical to the structural integrity of the Titanic, or in this case, the lack thereof. The Titanic had over 3 million rivets holding the ship together. They were crucial to the ship's construction, and it seems that they were much cheaper than they should have been. In 1998, Tim Falk conducted a study for the National Institute of Standards and Technology. Falk found that the rivets contained high concentrations of slag. Slag is the residue left behind when iron ore is melted down. The problem? Slag is a terrible fit for the cold weather of the North Atlantic. It made the rivets far more brittle, which means that they were far more likely to break under strain, like, say, when metal hits an iceberg. This may help explain why the Titanic sank so quickly. Falk and Jennifer Hooper McCarty actually wrote a book called What Really Sank the Titanic. They argued that the rivets were cheap because Harland and Wolff, the ship's manufacturer, couldn't find enough iron or workers to make and assemble the rivets. As such, they made cheaper rivets. So, the ship wasn't built right. Warnings were ignored. The weather was freakishly calm, and the officer in charge of the bridge tried to do the perfectly reasonable thing and avoid the iceberg entirely. Had any one of these things gone differently, the Titanic may not have sank. But that's easy for us to say. The men involved here did the best they could. Mistakes were clearly made, just like mistakes were made every day. But in this instance, the mistakes conspired to cause one of the greatest ship's tragedies ever. If any one of these decisions or circumstances had gone differently, we could have had a different world. We almost did. That's it for Almost Something. I really hope to have another video in the next couple of weeks, and I hope you enjoyed this one. If you did enjoy what we had to say, please hit that like or thumbs up button. Definitely click on subscribe and make sure to click that bell so you get notifications when we have more videos. Have a great day, and don't let there be any almost in your life.